Hello, this is Jed Brewer with the Below the Line Club and study groups. It's really nice to have you on the call today and hope you're enjoying your increasingly last days of summer, it feels like. I know I'm in Northwest Washington and we have the fair in town, so that always makes it feel like the end of summer is approaching. Today, we're going to be talking about best-in-class field service practices. So what's the cost of inefficient field service activities? One of the things we find is that many companies are surprised to learn the true drain on their company from things such as unnecessary service dispatches, accessible billable service hours, incomplete or disorganized maintenance records. So really pleased to have Jon Kelly, who's the CEO and founder of Canary Compliance and an expert in this area, on the call to give us some best practices from his experience as it relates to field service. So brief introduction of Jon Kelly. He graduated from Wharton School and spent 5 years working for ExxonMobil afterwards in various sales and marketing roles. But in 2015, he left ExxonMobil to found Canary Compliance, which is a company he owns today. It's a remote tank monitoring technology company that's focused on simplifying the ownership of underground storage tanks. And Jon, you may hear from his accent, was born in London, England, and now lives in Philadelphia, PA. And Canary Compliance, just high level about what they do, is provide retailers and wholesalers with smart, simple remote tank monitoring solutions. And different members of our study groups will use Canary or aspects of some of their remote tank monitoring features, which range from tank monitor connectivity and hardware to access inventory and also alarm data. So with that brief introduction about Jon Kelly and Canary Compliance, Jon, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to share with the audience a little bit about best-in-class field service practices. And for the audience, we want this to be educational for you. So if you have a question that comes up, please type in the dialog box and just go to Webinar Framework your question. I'll be able to read it and I'll relay it to Jon at the appropriate time. So, Jon, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Jed. I appreciate that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great, Jon.
Perfect. Very good. Well, thanks everyone for joining the call today. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you here. Over the next half hour or so, what Jed had asked me to prepare was a little bit of insight and information around what we've learned in the field based on our interactions with our customers and so on and so forth, specifically around field service costs. As retailers, I'm sure many of those of you on the phone deal with all the various petroleum equipment that you have at your sites, be it the underground storage tanks, lines, sensors, tank monitors, the dispensers, all that kind of stuff. And in order to maintain uptime and profitability, it's critical that that equipment is working properly and also critical for environmental and regulatory compliance. Part of ensuring that that equipment is operational and in compliance is maintaining it and taking care of it. And although as we've moved into the 21st century here, more and more of that stuff is possible to do from afar, there are still requirements for on-site service as well. And what we've found is that in many cases, retailers have been doing things a certain way for a long time, and they don't necessarily have a full grasp of what the cost is in terms of keeping that equipment up and running and compliant. We've done some analysis and developed some insights that I think you'll find quite interesting, and I hope can lead to some productive discussion here today around the surprising areas where field service can get kind of expensive. So with that said, as Jed pointed out earlier, the floor is open for anyone to chime in with questions or to send them into the chat. We really hope this is something of a dialogue, not just a lecture. So please feel free to chip in with any thoughts or comments at any time. So with that, I'll just kind of get things started. As I mentioned, we're going to kind of review some of the common field service challenges that we have seen, especially in retail. And then once we've gone through some of those, we'll highlight best practices for how to avoid some of those pitfalls that get expensive quite quickly if you're not careful. And then we'll review a real-world example of the business impact of implementing these best practices specifically through technology. So hopefully this, like I said, fuels some discussion here. And with that, I'll just kind of get started. The first area where we see people spending time and money and energy and effort is on unnecessary service dispatches, specifically around tank monitor alarms. And what this means is that someone is actually rolling a truck out to the location, whether it's somebody internally or a third party, going out to go and fix a problem that they think is occurring at a site. We see this quite frequently, and an example of that is, for those of you who are familiar with tank monitoring equipment, pressurized line leak detection is a method of leak detection. And when the tank monitor goes into alarm, indicating that this type of, that there's a problem with this equipment, that can shut the pumps down. That obviously becomes very alarming to whoever is on site, because suddenly you're unable to pump gas and you've got customers lining up, getting upset, all this kind of thing. Now, the issue with these PLLD shutdown alarms, as they're known, is that they can occur for a variety of different reasons. Unfortunately, the tank monitors only indicate that the alarm has occurred. They don't explain why it has occurred. And so in some cases, what you end up with is sending out a service technician, like I said, either a third party or in-house, to go and do that investigation. Now, these specific types of alarms can occur for three different reasons, as I said. One, it can be an actual leak, and that's a catastrophic event that you need to go and address immediately with all your resources. Sometimes, however, those alarms can occur if there's just some pressure that builds up in the line. You might get two people pumping at the same time and the air pressure kind of builds up, and it can trigger that because it thinks that there might be some kind of a leak, but there's actually not. The way that you resolve that alarm is simply by rerunning a line test in order to, clear out and confirm and validate if that alarm is still active, and that can sometimes solve the problem on its own. The other thing that can trigger this alarm is running out of gas. If you go below a certain threshold in the tank in terms of the volume that's in the ground, you can actually trigger this type of alarm. In that case, obviously, you don't need a service technician, you need a fuel delivery. And that's one of the more common instances that we see, where someone on site sees that the pumps have shut down, they call a service technician, the technician arrives, they does some investigative work, and an hour and a half later, while they're billing you the whole time, they determine that there's not enough gas in the ground to keep the dispensers running safely, because it would blow out the motor, and so the pump shut down. Obviously, that's a unfortunate occurrence. The operator's doing the right thing, trying to get the pumps back up and running so that everything can be operational and you can be making money. However, in that case, that's a major waste of money with that service provider coming out to do that investigative work. This is something where, it can get very, very costly. Sending a service technician out, we see the average cost of those types of service dispatches being anywhere in the $275 to $300 range. If you've got remote sites, that becomes even more expensive. Really, this is a huge challenge for the industry to avoid these types of unnecessary visits as much as possible.
Jon, question for you. In your experience working with retailers, these unnecessary, I guess, service dispatches, what % of alarms would you guesstimate are unnecessary, where sending the tech out was not sort of the right solution to the alarm?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it's, I think the question of, what's necessary and what alarm and all of this is a complicated one, because if you do send a service technician out because you have one of these PLLD alarms and they discover that it is indeed a line leak, that was necessary. However, if you send them out and it's, that they're out of fuel, that was not necessary, and easy in hindsight to determine what was necessary and what was not. And that's where technology can play a role in terms of actually discerning what the trigger of this alarm was. And we've done some analysis with some of our customers, looking at kind of before and after states of what was going on. And we have some good examples a little bit later in the deck here that I'll share of an instance where this was a particular type of alarm that was really causing them a lot of grief. Their internal policy was to dispatch every time because they didn't have any visibility into the root cause. And you can see it was a substantial drop-off in the number of alarms. Obviously, that's one particular case study of a 50 location customer, but they dropped their number of service calls it was substantial. The numbers we'll see a little bit later in the deck, but it's definitely a real issue that's out there.
Okay, well, I'll wait for the numbers later. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. But yeah, this is just one example of the types of instances when a service technician can run out and not necessarily be required to be there. And again, there are some solutions and best practices to avoid this pitfall that I'll share shortly. Another one that we've seen is excessive billable hours on site. Now, in some cases, people have their own maintenance technicians, and so billable hours don't really apply, but it's really the opportunity cost of their time on site. But if you do use third parties for maintenance and service, and a tech shows up and he's not been informed what the problem is that he's supposed to solve, he has to spend some period of time, typically 30, 45 minutes, kind of uncovering what's the lay of the land, doing some detective work to figure out what is even there to solve. This is very common, especially for folks who have company-owned dealer-operated sites, where a dealer may call in something saying, hey, the Veeder-Root's beeping again. Give no further visibility into what the specific problem is. A service technician rolls out and then has to kind of figure out from ground zero what's going on. And this is a huge waste of time. It's a waste of money. And because when those service technicians arrive, the clock starts as soon as they leave their office, and the clock doesn't stop until they leave the location and get back to where they came from. So the more time that they spend doing detective work once they arrive on site, the more that's coming out of your pocket to pay for it, instead of them just being on site to get the job done efficiently with the right kind of guidance. With better visibility into what the problem is before they actually head to the store, and we can show you here in a bit what that looks like, they can certainly spend a lot less time on site, making sure that you're not paying any extra charges for them being there and doing that discovery work when it could be provided ahead of time. Another example of this is repeat visits. A lot of times what we've heard is alarm goes off, a service call gets made, a technician shows up on site, and they get there and they say, oh, nothing wrong with the Veeder-Root, everything's all functions normal at this point, and then they leave. The problem is that alarm may have been due to bad wiring in a probe, in a sensor, something like that, or it's going in and out of alarm with some degree of frequency. This can occur quite a lot. And when this happens, it's just a matter of pure chance and timing if the technician shows up and that alarm is still active. Technically, they are supposed to print out the alarm history and see what's been going on, but that doesn't always occur, and a technician may show up, see the green light, and then just leave. Again, you've been billed for that visit and you haven't solved the problem, and so that's going to start to eat away at your bottom line if it continues. These types of alarms can occur quite frequently with wiring issues on probes and sensors. There are lots of probes and lots of sensors at certain locations, and wiring can go bad. So this is just one that we see quite frequently as well, where just a matter of timing can start to hit your bottom line if you're not careful, and if the technician doesn't know what they should be. Again, it kind of goes with the first one or the previous one that I was just sharing about no visibility into what the alarm was before they showed up. That can then trigger repeat visits because they haven't addressed the problem. They have to come back again to take care of it. A final one that we've got here is incomplete and disorganized maintenance records. When problems get solved, in sort of a one-off basis, a reactive fashion, and the documentation isn't complete as far as how that fits in with the history of what's happened at that location, what you end up missing is the trends and the patterns that have been going on at that location. In some cases, retailers know their sites well enough to know which ones are starting to cost them money because they're going back time and again. However, if you have a number of locations, it can be very difficult to keep that in your head. And if you're doing everything with pen and paper or in spreadsheets, it can really limit your ability to get to the root cause of problems, identify areas where maybe it's worth a CapEx project in order to really address the problem once and for all, as opposed to continuing to spend money solving the same problem over and over again anytime a particular weather event happens or anytime a particular occurrence takes place at the location that tends to trigger alarms. And if you don't have that kind of trend visibility, then what you can end up with is, again, continued spend on the same problem one after the other. It's much easier when you can actually view those patterns, and there is technology available today to allow you to actually look into that and notice these patterns, trends, see historical evidence that might drive your decision-making process moving forward to help nip these problems in the bud before they become too painful and too recurring. So how do we solve these problems? And it's 5 that we just reviewed there, and they sound grim if you're not taking care of them, but there are ways around this. The first one is to establish secure and reliable remote connectivity. Some retailers already have established remote connectivity to their tank monitors and equipment like that, but not everybody has. Not everyone has done it securely. We'll get into some of the pitfalls and challenges of remote connectivity in a second here, but it is important to have remote visibility to that information. If you're not on site every day, you can't necessarily depend on your store clerk to provide you with the visibility into what's happening with that tank monitor and that equipment on site, because they're typically not sufficiently trained and they typically have other priorities, namely taking care of the customer when they're standing in line for their coffee and donuts and cigarettes. So you really want them to focus on the customer. You don't want them to be scrambling around worrying about what's happening with the tank monitor. So establishing remote visibility to that is really critical. Second of all, conducting consistent and precise remote analysis of equipment issues before deciding whether or not to send out field service is really important. If you don't know what's happening and you don't have visibility into it, then you may be sending out people unnecessarily. What we found, however, is that sometimes there are different people might find out about an alarm. There might be a kind of informal phone tree type process, and some people may prioritize it one way, some people may prioritize it another way, but you don't have consistency and precision in the way that these equipment issues get looked at, reviewed, and analyzed for that action. And so finding a way to implement some kind of consistent process, protocol is really important, so that you treat every single alarm the same way, so that when that PLLD alarm occurs, the first thing that's being looked at is how much gas is in the tank, because we don't want to send out a tech to go and tell us we're out of fuel. We want to send out a fuel truck. So that's the type of thing where we can, you really see that benefit and the ROI immediately from leveraging this best practice. The next one is executing best-in-class remote troubleshooting. The way that, what we mean by this is that when these alarms do occur, do as much as you can without going to the location before you go to the location. Now, this obviously requires remote connectivity, which was the first bullet point that we put here. Everything is kind of underpinned by connectivity, but providing, conducting that remote troubleshooting, being able to, take the required steps to address these issues as they've come up is really important. This also ties to the previous bullet point about consistency and precision. If you know what the problem is, you can then take some remote action before sending somebody out to the site, thus eliminating that $275 to $300 spend every time you send out a service technician to go and do something. A lot of times you can address these problems remotely, before you need to do anything. And it's really a matter of doing it consistently and efficiently and with precision, so that you're not wasting money on field service, sending a guy out to the location to do it when you could do it from the office. Now, of course, sometimes a wrench needs to get turned, a lid needs to get lifted, or a sensor needs to get replaced. If you do that, then you need to provide clear, precise service instructions to that technician so that they can get on site, they can immediately start their work, they know exactly what equipment to go and focus on, they can replace it, bring the right parts with them the first time, and then get on with their day, which means that your site is getting on with its day, selling more fuel and doing what you need to do in order to keep your business operational. So providing that type of visibility is very, very important. Logging equipment, full maintenance records in cloud storage. Cloud storage obviously is kind of a bias these days, because people like to leverage software and platforms like that. But really logging full maintenance records and keeping clear visibility into what's been happening over time allows you to notice patterns and trends, so that you're not solving the same problem time and again, when you could address the root cause and eliminate any further potential spend on an issue that may be continuing to occur at a location. One of the things,
what share of customers, of firms presently are implementing these best practices, like in totality?
Yeah, great question. So I think, more and more we're seeing folks get equipment connected remotely. The security piece is an important kind of asterisk on that one that I'm going to touch on in a second here. But we're seeing more and more folks get towards, a connected future. the consistent and precise remote analysis most of the time, and then all the remote troubleshooting and providing the instructions, that can historically depend on the quality of the people at an organization. And if you have folks that have been doing it for a long time and provide the guidance, do the troubleshooting, have the software in order to do it, then it can get done. However, the problem is when that person's on vacation or they're out, or or they leave or they retire or whatever it may be, they get promoted, that can then fall by the wayside. And so what we're seeing these days is that these best practices, which historically can be done with people, can actually be done with technology. And there are automated systems that can actually analyze these types of issues remotely using rules engines and sort of sophisticated algorithms and logic and stuff like that, in order to actually get to these root causes in essentially real time, by not only telling you what type of alarm is occurring, but then probing into the equipment that it's connected to in order to say, hey, let me do some of the troubleshooting in a consistent fashion based on a preset kind of business rule, in order to then determine what action needs to get taken, so that you're not depending on individual workforce to do this type of stuff. So I think some of these best practices have been implemented over time. However, what we're really seeing now is a shift from using people to do this to using technology to do this. And that's kind of this 21st century move that we're seeing with the Internet of Things and improved connectivity and improved software as a service offerings that allow you to do these types of things with software as opposed to people, which is a much more efficient and cost-effective way of doing things. I'd say, in direct response to your question, Jed, I think that there are systems out there that provide remote visibility. There are not a ton of systems out there that necessarily do the full kind of automated troubleshooting to help folks manage stuff with a great degree of precision and remote analysis, because again, the industry has historically leveraged people to do stuff using technology, as opposed to training the technology to do the work to free up the people to do the higher value type judgment calls that are often required when it comes to field service and compliance and maintenance and operations.
Okay, thanks.
So I wanted to share an example of exactly what we just talked about, and this gets to Jed's question earlier, but also the difference between leveraging people and leveraging technology, and the impact that consistency and precision can have when it comes to remote troubleshooting and eliminating field service inefficiency. So you can see here, this is an example, real world example of a 50 location retailer that experienced a $13,000 reduction in maintenance spend in just a month after implementing these best practices using technology as opposed to just putting people on it. What we saw was that the number of sites that were actually in compliance before any of the technology was, they actually already had remote connectivity, but they were using a fairly primitive software tool in order to manually poll for alarms and see what's going on and do any kind of remote troubleshooting. And it just depended on people, and they didn't have the right qualified type of people. They didn't have the consistency of visibility into what they needed to see. And so what it was doing is it was causing their sites to be out of compliance, which is a risk when it comes to just regulatory scrutiny. They were spending a ton of money on maintenance for their tank monitors. They were doing the right thing. They had alarms come through and they would send somebody out to go and fix it. But the problem was they weren't doing it with much precision or consistency, and they didn't have the visibility into the root cause. So what ended up happening was they were just sending folks out time and again for the same types of issues. You can see that 16 repeat visits in just that 1 month. As soon as they implemented this technology, which allowed them to automate some of the diagnostic work and the troubleshooting, as well as give them better abilities to conduct remote troubleshooting and address alarms from afar, you can see they cut their dispatches down by more than 50%. They improved their actual compliance performance, and they dramatically dropped the number of repeat visits that were occurring due to maybe a technician not knowing what he needed before he got to the site. And this trend continued to improve over time. As they got to the root cause of some of these issues, not only did that create a dramatic drop off in the first month, but over time it kept going further, and then it kept them at a much lower sort of steady state of the types of dispatch and service calls that were required in order to sustain a higher level of compliance performance with a lower number of repeat visits, because they were getting to the bottom of these issues as opposed to just band-aiding them every single time. So this is an example where there were no additional people hired. There was no additional personnel training required. It was simply a software implementation that was done by this customer to leverage some of the automated technology that's out there to help actually implement the best practices without a huge lift when it comes to either training or hiring. Does that make sense, Jed? Does this help kind of answer the questions that you've brought up so far?
Yeah, that does. Yeah, it's interesting to see the drop off that you said that this sample firm, one firm experience. Fairly substantial.
Yeah, they were really pleased with how this kind of worked out, and again, it also allowed them not to necessarily depend too much on one individual, because as it turns out, a few months later, the individual who had been primarily responsible for handling the maintenance retired, and so they had to bring in someone new, someone much younger, and that person was able to sustain the same level of performance because the technology was helping create that consistent process and the precise understanding of what was actually going on with these alarms, and then providing guidance as to how exactly to take care of it. Do you do it remotely? Do you send a service technician? If you send a service technician, what do you tell them to do? It was really supporting that workflow in a consistent way.
Mm-hmm.
So as I pointed out earlier, connectivity it underpins all of this. If you don't have remote visibility to your equipment, then you can't really do any of these things. You can't leverage software and you can't leverage technology to help improve your internal efficiency and reduce your spend. So, and we see people sometimes having challenges with connectivity for a number of reasons. Just getting it established first and foremost can be tough. A lot of people have some of the older tank monitoring equipment from different manufacturers, and it requires quite a heavy investment in some cases, not only from an equipment standpoint. You've got to get these specialized cards that go into your tank monitors. You've then got to set up remote connectivity firewalls and VPNs and stuff like that if you want to do it securely, and it can take quite a number of things being synced up properly between your internal IT department, a managed network service provider, your tank monitor, the card that's in the tank monitor, so on and so forth. That whole chain needs to be, really nicely lined up. And if one thing goes wrong, it can get disrupted. So a lot of folks say, just screw it. It's not worth the effort to get this thing set up in the first place, and it's not worth the effort to maintain it, because a lot of times, they see they have to send out service technicians back to the site. They've got to spend all this IT resource on, continuing to maintain it. One of the other problems that we see with remote connectivity is that sometimes when people get these things set up and they're leveraging IP addresses, which is just kind of a common way of dialing into these monitors, these IP addresses are sometimes exposed to the open internet. And what that means is that people are able to access the locations without necessarily being authorized. And we see this all the time. There have been some scans of the internet where there are thousands and thousands of tank monitors that customers don't even realize are exposed to the open internet. And it's like, okay, well, so what if someone sees my fuel levels? Well, so what if someone sees your fuel levels? Maybe the perspective, but what if they can see more information and they can actually change the programming of your tank monitor? And they can say, hey, I want to make this 10,000 gallon tank actually look like it's a 16,000 gallon tank, so that next time someone delivers, they'll drop a load of 12,000 gallons and there'll be a huge spill. That type of, we've seen hacking all over the place with Colonial Pipeline and this and that, people hacking in just really to create havoc. And if you have that type of exposure and and unauthorized access to your information, that's a real risk that could put you and your business at serious, that could expose you from a cybersecurity standpoint and an operational and financial standpoint as well. One of the other things there that I mentioned is, some of the older tank monitoring equipment was not designed in the 21st century. It was designed in the 80s and 90s. And it was not a time when cybersecurity was really top of mind. A Vita root, you can disable the password by flipping a dip switch inside of it. And typically the password is 6 zeros or it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think everybody kind of just knows that. And so it really creates vulnerable endpoints if you have this equipment actually connected to your network without the requisite VPN and firewall cybersecurity measures in place. And so all of that, in order to counteract some of these challenges, A lot of people have to, build up their IT department, which requires, people, it requires time, it requires money, and that can really undermine the remote connectivity benefits that are achieved if you're not doing it effectively. And so I also wanted to share some of the best practices that we've seen with respect to remote tank monitor connectivity, which is to use dedicated plug and play remote connectivity solutions that are fit for purpose. If you've got stuff that is off the shelf or you're kind of DIYing it, that's where the cybersecurity risk and the headache from maintenance can kind of come into place, because they're just a lot easier they're a lot more vulnerable, I should say, to outside interference. The other thing is protecting your data with user access management. This is the type of thing that's standard for software as a service companies these days, but for a lot of the legacy systems that may exist out there was not necessarily a priority when it was originally developed. And I think, all of that kind of ties into eliminating the vulnerable network endpoints. Some folks have started using either VPNs or cellular enabled technology or some other kind of remote connectivity, so that you don't need to worry about having this old TLS 350 or whatever it may be actually resting on your network, because if that's an exposure point for you, they could get in and maybe you don't care if they access the tank monitor data, but if they're able to hack through the tank monitor and actually get into your internal network, you've got people's HR records, you've got point of sale information, you've got credit card info on your network. That's all a risk that's potentially getting exposed if you have these old pieces of technology as vulnerable endpoints. And also with all of this, if you can simplify and streamline remote tank monitor connectivity by using fit for purpose, things like cellular enabled technology, your IT staff can focus on primary business operations as opposed to continuing to patch up connectivity challenges that they run into in the field. So really it frees them up to grow the business and focus on streamlining the business with the stuff that they're hired to do, not just kind of the Band-Aid work that can sometimes be required with remote equipment connectivity. So, a lot of information there that we've shared, and I know we're kind of bumping up on our time commitment here, but that's kind of what we see from some of the challenges, some of the best practices, and then just wanted to really highlight to people that there are technology solutions out there that can enable the implementation of these best practices very seamlessly and very efficiently. They can reduce the cybersecurity risk and the maintenance headaches associated with remote tank monitor connectivity. And that's really kind of the direction that the industry is going, is to try and make operations as automated as possible. Obviously, facility managers and facility staff and maintenance personnel are going to be required forever. Someone's got to go and make a judgment call as to lifting the lid and doing the project and all that type of stuff. But if you can superpower those people by giving them really good technology under the hood that's going to drive them to the right places with the right resources and information at the right time, then you can keep your sites up and running, operational, in compliance, all the things that you need to do to focus on growing your business and running it profitably.
Well, thank you so much, Jon. Yeah, appreciate you sharing your contact information here as well. And it looks like that's a little bit about Canary Compliance on the slide. And some of the products that you have. I assume these products here solve a lot of these issues and implement these best practices. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Yeah. It'd be remiss not to mention what we do at Canary. We do have plug and play cellular connectivity equipment for tank monitoring stuff that allows you to get up and running quickly when it comes to getting visibility to that data. And then we've developed some sort of sophisticated software that helps implement some of those best practices that we mentioned earlier, specifically our Alarm Assist software, which provides that consistent and remote troubleshooting to make sure that you know exactly when you need to go out, what you need to go out for, and how you need to solve it, so you're not spending additional time and resources and money on unnecessary visits and field service. So this is my contact information. You can feel free to contact me, any of you on the call. If you have follow-up questions, certainly touch base with me directly, or Jed can point you towards me. But we'd love to hear your feedback on what we've done today. I know we're a bit tight on time, but always curious to chat with folks about other best practices and where maybe we missed the mark on some of these things, because although we've observed this from our customers, many of you on the call today do this day in and day out. And so maybe there are some things that we could learn from you as well. We're always open to that type of thing. So Jed, with that, I'll kind of wrap up and let you close things out here and take it from there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jon. And I know how I first learned about you was through another study group member who shared you as a best idea because they were having these alarm issues and sending people out unnecessarily, and implemented some of Canary's products and felt like they were able to save money. So if I recall correctly, it was a winning best idea at that study group meeting. But really appreciate your time here and the audience as well. Just want to say one other thing before we sign off. We'll send these presentation slides out to you as well as Jon's contact information if you want to follow up with him with any more questions. And lastly, a plug for our next webinar is going to be Thursday, September 16th. So really pleased to have David McClaskey of the McClaskey Excellence Institute, who will be our featured presenter. And David is a Baldrige Award winner, but really works with firms on creating excellence within your organization. And he's going to be focusing on process excellence and how to design all of our company processes for 100% execution. And he'll tell us it's not 95% execution, it's 100%, and how we can create that roadmap for our company. So encourage you to join in Thursday, September 16th. You'll receive more information about that in the future. So thank you again, Jon, and everybody have a great day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Jed. Take care.